Hello, welcome to the Native Entities Capacity Grant webinar. I'm joined by my colleague Shauna from NDIA, along with other folks from NDIA who are supporting. We hope the information provided today will help you as you pursue the capacity grants coming in September. This is an exciting time for me and for you. I've been telling folks since I've been in the digital equity space that funds are coming to support digital equity efforts specifically for Indigenous communities, and now they're finally here. So I'm so excited for this. So I'm going to pass it to Shauna to introduce herself first.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here today. I'm excited to talk about the Native Entities Capacity Grant. I'm Shauna Edson, the Senior Program Manager at the NDIA. And Abby and Pamelia, do you want to just say hi really fast so people know who you are?
Sure. I'm Abby Waldrop at NDIA, and I work a lot with our digital navigator programs, and I support DaVita with some of the work with Indigenous communities.
Hi everyone, I'm Pamela Gide. I'm the Training and Community Engagement Manager. So you might see me in the Digital Inclusion 101 webinars and community calls, and happy to be here with you all.
So you heard from Shauna, and I'll just introduce myself again. Yeah, it's DaVita Del Mar Yunus Be between us do kiltachini bashashin ki ani dashite do torachini dashnala. Hello, my name is DaVita Del Mar. I'm a citizen of the Navajo Nation. I serve as the Digital Inclusion Manager for Amerind, a tribally owned and operated company. Our efforts in critical infrastructure and the critical infrastructure division, are to assist tribal nations to develop and deploy the most important 21st century critical infrastructure, high-speed broadband internet. Apologies, there we go. Amerind is a close partner with NDIA, where we have worked together to amplify digital inclusion efforts in Indian country, most notably supporting 7 digital navigator sites and developing programs in direct support of digital inclusion practitioners in Indigenous communities, through the essential partnership with the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, or NDIA.
Okay, so NDIA, or the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, advances digital equity by supporting community programs and equipping policymakers to act. We work collaboratively with more than 1,700 digital inclusion practitioners, 50 states, plus DC, American Samoa, Northern Mariana Islands, Guam, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, and 31 tribal entities. NDIA advocates for broadband access, tech devices, digital skills training, and tech support. We bring together digital inclusion programs throughout the country and provide a voice for national advocacy across all areas of digital equity. One of the big things about NDIA is our community. A lot of times folks doing digital equity work might be the only person in the organization, sometimes city, or even your whole region. So we're happy to bring folks together so we can support each other in this work.
I also want to point out real quick, sorry, before you go into the agenda, I forgot to put this in my notes, is just that if you have a question during the session today, you can use the Q&A function or the chat. We have folks, of course, that are supporting us, and we'll be sure to try to get to your question. So thank you. Sorry, Shauna, go back to you.
Yeah, that's okay, thanks. Yeah, please do use the chat function. I don't think we have the Q&A set up on this. Oh, we do. Okay, never mind. Either one of those. So today we're going to go over digital inclusion in broad strokes, an overview of the key elements there, a short description of the Digital Equity Act, things you need to know about the Native Entities Capacity Grant Program. And then, like DaVita said, we're hoping to have 15 minutes for Q&A at the end to answer your questions, and we will do our best to be able to answer things that you have that you're concerned about. So I'm going to start with a quick overview of digital inclusion. So we're all on the same page with the same understanding of some key terms. There we go. Right. It's slow to respond. Okay, so the digital divide is the gap between those who have affordable access, skills, and support to engage online and those who do not. The digital divide disproportionately affects Native Americans, Alaskan Natives, Native Hawaiians, Black people and other people of color, households with low income, people with disabilities, and people in rural areas and older adults. Digital equity is a world where everyone in our communities can get online and use the internet in the way that they want to, without worrying about things like if their internet connection is stable, if they can afford next month's internet bill, if their device is appropriate for what they're trying to do, and if they have the skills necessary to navigate the internet safely. When we use the word equity, we accurately acknowledge the systemic barriers that must be addressed when achieving equity for all communities. And digital inclusion is the activities necessary to achieve digital equity, which is access to reliable and affordable high-speed internet, access to affordable and appropriate devices, providing digital skills training and support. So the solution, how can we be a more digitally equitable community? Affordable broadband, affordable devices, and digital skills training are key elements of digital equity. This can look different for every community, and there's not one solution that works for everyone. Digital inclusion activities that support digital equity include digital skills training. How can you support digital skill building in your community? How are people using technology, and how can technology support individuals in your community? Is affordable high-speed internet available in your community? Do people in your community have access to affordable devices that are appropriate for the tasks they need to accomplish? And is there ongoing technical support? So let's shift to talk about the Digital Equity Act. I just want to do a quick overview of Digital Equity Act funding. The DEA was authorized by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021. The first set of funds in the Digital Equity Act was the State Planning Grant Program. The first award for the Planning Grant Program was to Louisiana on August 28th, 2022. That grant period has ended. The State Digital Equity Capacity Grant Program is the second set of funds available in the DEA. The Native Entities Capacity Grant Program funds are included in this program. So this is where what we're talking about today falls in the DEA. And the competitive grant program will likely start this summer or very early fall. Okay. So here's the Digital Equity Act timeline. States have already submitted their capacity grant applications, which were due at the end of May. U.S. territories have until July 31st to submit their applications. The applications for Native entities will open on September 25th, 2024, and close on February 7th, 2025. The first state award, the first state capacity award will be on or before August 28th, 2024, but we think it will be much sooner. We're not sure exactly when that will happen, but we're keeping an eye out for it to happen sooner rather than later. And then awards for the state capacity to states will be issued on a rolling basis. The competitive grant NOFO will be exactly 30 days after the first state capacity grant is awarded. That's why it's so important to pay attention to when that first state capacity grant is awarded. So when that NOFO comes out, the competitive NOFO will be published 30 days after the capacity grant. Native entities and states will have 60 days to apply after that NOFO is released, and territories will have 120 days to submit applications from the date of the NOFO is published. This means that Native entities and states will have 90 days from the date the first state capacity grant is awarded, and territories will have 150 days to get their applications in. We think those awards will be between $5 and $10 million, and they will be very competitive. So keep this in mind if you have a large project. Okay, so today we're going to be focusing on the Native Entities Capacity Grant Program. And first we'll cover some key things for you to keep in mind with this program. The most important details we pulled out of the NOFO. Like I said, applications will open September 25th and are due on February 7th, 2025. There's $45.3 million available for Native entities. And the grant award range will be from $500,000 to $2 million. In the Notice of Funding Opportunity, or NOFO, NTIA noted that they received a significant number of letters of intent from Native entities in response to the State Digital Equity Planning Grant NOFO in the summer of 2022. Due to that large amount of interest and limited funds, NTIA did not open an application window for Native entities under the 2022 planning grant. Instead, NTIA combined the funds for Native entities from the planning grant with the funds for Native entities in this NOFO. NTIA will award these funds to Native entities through a competitive grant process. This means that not everybody who applies will get funding. And Native entities do not need to include a past letter of intent, but will submit a new application for this grant opportunity. Okay, the NOFO says NTIA expects to begin making awards to Native entities in the summer of 2025, and funds will be issued on a rolling basis. If you are awarded funds, you must complete the grant within 5 years. Allowable uses. Native entities can use these funds without involvement from the states. However, if your goals and strategies are aligned with that of the state, your digital inclusion activities may align with the state's plan. Funds may be used for digital equity planning and implementation of the plans, or implementation projects alone, but will not be able to use the funds just for planning.
So for this grant, NTIA will define Native entities as Indian tribes, Alaska Native entities, and Native Hawaiian organizations who must appear on one of the following lists. The Native entity must be listed on the list before the closing of the application window to qualify as a Native entity for the grant. So this, oops, sorry, I think I'm on the wrong slide. Did I overstep you, Shauna? I apologize.
That's okay. Yeah, I was not quite finished We're trying out a new tool to go through the slides, and my computer is not responding super well to the slide change. So sorry about that, y'all.
I'll let her finish. Sorry.
Let me find the correct slide. Okay, so some other things funds can be used for. Funds can be used to provide subgrants to help implement digital inclusion activities. And Davida will go into more details about subgrants later. There's a 5% cap on funds for subgrant evaluation, a 3% cap for administrative costs, and there's a 10% cap for subsidies for affordable broadband programs, like the Affordable Connectivity Program. And there's certain specific rules around if you choose to implement an affordable broadband program. So make sure that you check those out in the NOFO if that's something you want to do. And these funds cannot be used for deployment projects. Okay. There we go, Davida.
Can I'm really sorry to interrupt. Can I jump in really quickly? Hi folks, it's Amy, the policy director at NDIA, and as we speak, we just got, and Mikhail put it in the chat, we just got the announcement that the first state capacity award was made to Nevada, which means what Shauna was just explaining a moment ago means the shot clock has started as of today. So the competitive NOFO will open up 30 days from now. So you can expect it July 26th. That's all. I will hand it back over to Davida and Shauna to talk more about, but just wanted to share the breaking news.
Great. So we're somewhat prepared for that. So if you want to learn more about the capacity grant, we do have some information towards the end of this that we'll go over, just because we thought that might be, an announcement any day now. So if you're looking towards that too, still stay on and we'll go over that. But back to the capacity grant. So eligible entities, excuse me. So for this grant, NTIA will define Native entities as Indian tribes, Alaska Native entities, and Native Hawaiian organizations who must appear on one of the following lists. The Native entity must be listed on the list before the closing of the application window to qualify as a Native entity for this grant. And this list also includes this second portion as well, which is U.S. Department of Interior with Office of Native Hawaiian Relations, and as well as the Department of Hawaiian Homelands. Ooh. Yeah, this new tool is a little wonky. Apologize. So again, you have to be on one of these lists before the closing of the application window. NTIA says to demonstrate eligibility. So the Native entity must receive a tribal government resolution or equivalent formal authorization from the governing body explicitly permitting the entity to apply on behalf of the Native entity. So please get permission from your Native entity in anticipation of this grant. Consortium applications. A consortium application is one that demonstrates working together to utilize resources or skill sets from Native entities. A consortium of Native entities or a group of Native entities applying together are allowed and encouraged to. NTIA stresses that NTIA stresses that Native entities may only apply once, either via a consortium application or an individual application, but not both. And applicants cannot be a part of multiple applications or consortia. If a Native entity is participating in multiple applications, this may delay NTIA's review of the application and may result in NTIA removing the entity from consideration for funding for both their individual application and any consortium applications to which they are party. And this is in page 46 of the NOFO if you want to consult that. Okay. So Native entities can, but are not required to use a portion of their capacity award, up to 7.25%, to create digital equity plans. While not mandatory, creating a digital equity plan before launching an implementation project would help design a digital equity vision with and for your community, a digital equity needs assessment, identify assets, and identify barriers to digital equity. So the NOFO outlines that requirements for a Native entity's digital equity plan, which are different from the requirements that are noted for the states in the planning grant. Native entities can use these funds without involvement from the states. However, if the Native entity's goals and strategies are aligned with that of the state, their digital inclusion activities may align with the state's digital equity plan. The plans may include data about digital equity as it currently stands for their community, a description of assets and partners for digital inclusion efforts, and strategies for implementing digital inclusion activities. So 7.25% of the funds awarded may be used to create a digital equity plan. In addition to the 7.25% of funds to create the plan, an additional 20% of the funds may be used to update or maintain the digital equity plan. Funds may not be used to create a digital equity plan alone. The planning must be coupled with the implementation of digital inclusion projects. So keep an eye out for NDIA's upcoming Indigenous Digital Inclusion Planning Guide that's coming this fall with more information on how to create digital equity plans and implementation strategies that can be helpful and specific to Indigenous communities. So why is it important for a tribe to develop their own digital equity plan? We asked some of our mentors this question, and here are their responses. So I'm not going to go in order, but this is what we've heard. So it sets a plan for future funding, federal, state, local for digital equity, explore sustainability options that ensure citizens can afford connectivity and the tribe can be self-sufficient. They can understand and utilize how technology can affirm and foster culture. They can identify resource and capacity grants to close the digital divide. And probably most importantly, it's a practice of sovereignty, managing a nation's own policies and codes that control the data infrastructure and networks. So it is essential for Native nations to take part in the digital equity movement, not only to take part in the historical funding that is and will become available for Indigenous communities, but also because it is an act of self-determination. Self-determination includes increasing governance capacities through strategic planning, dedicated funding, strong leadership support, and community engagement. So whether you decide to do a digital equity plan or not, implementing digital inclusion activities is probably why you're here. What do digital inclusion activities look like for Indigenous groups? We've broken it down to digital inclusion programs, events, and projects. So programs can be located within organizations that may not explicitly have a digital inclusion mission or vision. A program is planned and executed series of activities that address the need for one or more of the following: affordable and low-cost internet access, appropriate device access, digital skills instruction, or technical support. For example, the Pueblo of Jemez has a full-time digital navigator who's addressing all of these areas. Digital inclusion events are one-off or regularly occurring that draws attention to digital inclusion. They provide immediate digital inclusion services such as signups for free or low-cost internet, device distribution, and single training sessions. Digital inclusion projects are smaller, more agile activities that fall between programs and events. Fast-paced, short-term initiatives responding to a need or a current event can be components of a larger digital inclusion program. So for instance, Cayuse Native Solutions, pictured here, has hosted programs and previously helped folks sign up for ACP. Okay. Subgrants. An entity can use the funds to provide subgrants to other organizations who will implement digital inclusion activities within the Native entity's jurisdiction. So eligible entities for those subgrants are as listed. So political subdivisions, agencies, or instrumentalities of the state, such as state agencies, including public housing, Indian tribes, Alaska Native entities, or Native Hawaiian entities, foundations, corporations, institutions, associations that are nonprofits or are not a school, community anchor institutions, local educational agencies, workforce development programs, and partnerships between any of the above. A partnership with any of the above or an entity with that this Assistant Secretary says is in the public interest and that is not considered a school. I'll pass it back to Shauna, I believe.
Great. So covered populations. The grant should focus on covered populations. In the Digital Equity Act, covered populations are defined as individuals in households under 150% of poverty threshold, aging individuals, incarcerated individuals other than individuals in a federal correctional facility, veterans, individuals with disabilities, individuals with a language barrier, including individuals who are English learners and have low literacy levels, as well as individuals who are members of a racial or ethnic minority group, and individuals who primarily reside in a rural area. So I'm going to go over things to keep in mind when you're putting together your application. Focusing on these things as you're thinking about how you might want to apply is important. So kind of use these details for the application to guide your thinking on maybe what you want your projects to look like. So Davida talked earlier about consortium applications or applying alone. So that is what needs to be stated clearly on your application. If you do apply as a consortium, decide on one organization as the lead, and all the other organizations on the application will have a memorandum of understanding or an MOU. And Like Davida said, you can only be part of one consortium application or an individual application. So you cannot submit more than one application. Okay, so some things to include on your application and things to think through. A project narrative, which is an executive summary that talks about whether you do want to include funds to create a digital equity plan, kind of what you have envisioned for your project. Data that demonstrates the needs and barriers faced by your community, and specifically the covered populations within your community. So this could include things like the poverty rate, the covered populations that will be served and how many individuals within those covered populations will be served, the number of individuals that lack access to devices, and the number of people that are not using the internet or do not have a subscription, and so forth. And then you should state if you're going to request funds for the digital equity plan. If you do have funds requesting, or if you are requesting funds for a digital equity plan, you should include a description of your plan in the application. Obviously, like, you don't know in advance what that plan is going to look like, but you could say what you want the plan to include. So it could be planning activities, outputs of those activities, a timeline, how you plan to share with your plan with the broader community. You can also include things like a vision statement and implementation strategies along with measurable objectives. And then also include a description of implementation activities that will be funded by the grant and a project plan. So even if you don't have a digital equity plan, funding for a digital equity plan, you will need to include a plan for the digital inclusion activities that you plan to do with these funds. The application should also include anticipated long-term impact and a plan for sustainability. So this can include things like strategizing with key stakeholders and members of your community, as well as measuring the long-term impacts and benefits of digital equity within your community. And then if you plan to offer subgrants, include a description of the subgrants you'll fund and the process for awarding those funds. You also need to include information about other funding sources. So Native entities can apply for and receive funds from multiple federal or state grant programs, such as a subgrant from a state or NTIA's forthcoming Digital Equity Competitive Grant Program, which is now much sooner than we thought it might be, in addition to the Capacity Grant Program. These are different funding opportunities, and Native entities may apply separately for each of them. If you do this, you must mention in your application how the funds will be utilized for each of these programs. This demonstrates collaboration and coordination between agencies and ensures that funds are used as efficiently and effectively as possible. So the clarification should include a description of all other funding sources for digital inclusion and digital equity activities, including things like the status and role in the TDCP, subgrants from states, and so forth. Include the amount, as well as specific elements that you will be funding with the plan using those funds. And then you also have a consolidated budget form, which includes a detailed spreadsheet and budget narrative that outlines the necessity and basis for all the costs. So you're going to need to think through all of those things. And your standard federal financial assistance forms and documentation. Okay, so like I mentioned before, NTIA will be issuing the awards through a competitive process, and the NOFO outlines some elements that will be scored during the review process. So these are things, as you're drafting your application, Make sure that these things are really clear. The merit review will be done to make sure that applications align with the grant program's objectives, activities, and cost and budget. So NTIA will be looking for demonstrated need for the project and the purpose, as well as anticipated benefits for your community. They're also going to be looking for how strong your organization is to be able to do the grant. So how well you demonstrate that your organization can administer the grant as well as do the work or subgrant. The strength of your project implementation plan and budget, as well as how well you project results from the project and have a strong plan for evaluation. The next step after the merit review is a pragmatic review. In this, NTIA will be looking to see if the application will have a sustainable long-term impact on digital equity and inclusion. If you're serving 5 or more covered populations, that 65 or more % of the members of the Native entities population live in covered households. There is a lack of resources to address digital equity and inclusion in your community, meaning there are not already designated funds for this work. Ongoing collaboration with key stakeholders, realistic timelines and assumptions, and a plan to regularly engage with those impacted by the digital equity plan to improve the effectiveness of the plan. Okay, and I'm going to pass it back over to Davida.
So how can you prepare? Before you know it, summer will be over and this grant application will be upon us. Or before you know it, they announce the capacity grants today. So here are our tips to prepare. So working on getting the necessary approvals from your tribal government, including a tribal government resolution or equivalent formal or authorization from the governing body, explicitly permitting the entity to apply on behalf of the Native entity. So check page 48 of the NOFO if you want to look at that. Decide if you want to apply in a consortium or as a single entity. Determine if you would like to, 1, create digital equity plans with activities that support the implementation of that plan, or 2, just implementation activities to address digital equity barriers in your community. Also, keep an eye out for NDIA's upcoming Indigenous Digital Inclusion Planning Guide with more information on creating digital equity plans and implementation strategies. Also watch for NTIA's application guide for Native entities, which should be coming soon. Native entities should direct questions to digitalequity@ntia.gov. So use this time to focus on these standard forms as well. Register for your UEI as soon as possible. This process can take some time, so it is important for you to begin early, as in probably today if you haven't. UEIs are required for any type of federal grant, so this will also be helpful, will also be useful for the competitive digital equity grants that are about to be released. And back to Shauna. Oh, actually, sorry, the next one is mine, apologize. Some other ways you can stay involved is you can check out our resource for asset mapping for digital inclusion, which we have linked in the slides. Also, we have a new program called 7-Star Communities that is also coming out this fall. If you prepare an application for 7-Star Communities, it can help you kind of align, these different implementation strategies and things like that you've already done, and hopefully that you're making a plan for the future. But more information to come on that soon. Also, we have a working group. So the Indigenous Digital Inclusion Working Group is active and we meet monthly. So you can contact me to be added to that list if you're interested. Also, please let us know if there are other resources that can support you. And we've linked a form as well. If folks can also put that in the chat to give us more feedback. And back to Shauna.
Okay, we will also, it's not on here and things to do to prepare, but just want to throw out the NDIA will be publishing a blog post this week covering the same things that we talked about here. So watch for that as well. And then we do have time for questions now.
Well, Shauna, I don't know if you want to briefly cover competitive, just since we have a little bit of
Yeah.
time. Okay.
We do have time. I'm happy to jump in. I think we have actually like a short 5-minute thing with 3 slides to talk about the competitive grant. But before we do that, are there any specific questions specific to this capacity that we can focus on? Okay, so there's a question in the chat. Can a Native entity use a local government to apply on its behalf for helping to administer the funds? So Michelle, we did have the slide that went over the entities that are eligible. Let me go over that. So as long as it's one of those entities listed, you can use it. So if you're, can you maybe expand a little bit what you mean by local government? Are you talking about a government of the Native Nation or a government of the state? Oh, thanks for doing that. Okay. Without that, so you can have, you have to be listed on the eligible entities list. You can designate a nonprofit or another organization to be the administrating applicant, but you do need to go through the process of getting a tribal government resolution stating that that entity will is authorized to be the governing body for this application. Okay.
Yeah, Shauna, I don't know if you saw it, but Michelle clarified her question in the chat. She says, like, if all the tribes in the Lake and Penn Borough request the borough to be the lead applicant on behalf of the tribes, is that allowable?
Yes, as long as everybody has, there's 2 ways to do that, Michelle. So as long if everybody is on the eligible entities list, you can apply in a consortium application. If there's just one entity that's on the eligible entities list, and that entity wants to be a lead entity, they could possibly subgrant to applicants to provide funding for other folks, but they do need to be in the jurisdiction of that Native entity. So it's a little tricky that way. Hopefully I answered that. If you would like more clarification, let me know. Okay.
So there's one in the Q&A. I don't know if you saw that. So how do digital equity projects under other federal programs or projects included in state digital equity plans work with the capacity grant?
Okay, so this is where we need to be really clear on funding. So you just need to make sure you're not trying to fund the same activities more than once. So if you have a project under other federal programs or your state digital equity plan, and you plan to ask for capacity grant funds as well, you just need to state how those other programs and projects are funding and how the work in this capacity grant application will be different. So what are you doing that's outside of the capacity of those other funds? Are you doing a different type of activity or program? Is it a different computer lab? And you need to state that very clearly. The NTIA is just really going to want to make sure that they are not funding the same thing using federal funds more than once.
Okay, so there's another one. Does receipt of a Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program or TBCP Round 1 or 2 award impact the likelihood of an award in the NADA capacity program?
As I'm not a federal government employee, I can't say exactly how the impact will be, but they are different funding opportunities. And as long as you are very clear that there's a demonstrated need for the funds that you're requesting, and that the funds will have a unique purpose for activities and projects, that should increase your chances of getting funding.
So in the chat, there's another question. Does purchasing or installing Wi-Fi equipment for public use count as an eligible expense?
So well, I'm gonna have to get back to you on that one. I think it's a little bit, you're not allowed to do broadband deployment projects, but if there is a project that supports digital inclusion activities, so say if you need to install an antenna on a building, there is a small amount that you can use for that. But in general, no. And Amy, I don't know if you have any more to add to that.
Yeah, it would be under the use of like the long thing that's like instrumentation and technology. It would be under that use case. And I though agree with Shauna that it would have to be tied to digital equity purposes, and then it perhaps in the affordable broadband, like that would be the purpose, and then but only there would be a cap of how much you could use for it.
Okay, and do we have any other questions, or should we talk about the capacity grant?
Well, real quick, the form, the Google form, isn't open. Could you just kind of change your permissions on that before we? And yes, Pamela, I wonder if you could share screen again for the capacity grant or competitive. Whose idea was it to have the same C, the same letters?
Okay, yeah, it's terrible. They're so close to each other and the way they sound. Okay, the survey should be open. I apologize about that. Let me know if it doesn't work for you still. Okay, so the competitive grant purpose. So since it was just the first state award was just announced, that means the NOFO will come out in 30 days. And states and native entities will have 60 days to apply. So that puts us at 90 days out. Territories will have 150 days out from today to get our applications in. So we will not know all the specifics until the NOFO is released. But there are some details in the Digital Equity Act that we can look to. So the goal of the competitive grant program is to support efforts to achieve digital equity, promote digital inclusion activities, and spur greater adoption of broadband among covered populations. While this goal is a little bit vague, you can use your Native Nations Digital Equity Plan. If you don't have that or don't have one, you can use digital inclusion activities as a potential guidepost if these are known at the time of your application. And competitive grants will not necessarily be limited to projects that assist in the implementation of plans, but you can use it as a goal post moving forward. I do know there are some set asides for the competitive grant program. Congress allocated 1.25 billion for this program. However, from that amount, there are set asides for certain uses. These include a 5% set aside for NTIA, a 5% set aside, which is 62.5 million, if my math is correct, and you all might want to check that because I haven't had time to double check it yet, for tribal entities, and then a 1% set aside for territories. The covered populations and eligible entities are the same ones noted for that we just talked about in the Native Entity Capacity Grant Program. So some other things to know. There will be a required 10% or more match. The federal government by law is only allowed to fund 90% of this grant. However, there is a waiver that you can fill out for demonstrating financial need. And we think this match will be cash or in kind. So for example, your team's time and what you're contributing to the project can all count towards that 10% match. There's a 5-year grant period with 4 years as a period of performance and 1 year for evaluation. No more than 10% can go towards administrative costs. No more than 10% for program evaluation. We expect 3 NOFOs for this grant program, which means that funding that I mentioned before will be broken down into 3 buckets of funding. And awards are expected for states and Native entities between $5 and $10 million. And states and Native entities will have 60 days to apply once the NOFO is published. So things that you can use these funds for. Digital inclusion activities that benefit the covered populations, broadband adoption for covered populations, which includes education and employment opportunities, training programs for basic, advanced, and applied skills. I want to note here that this covers a range of training programs, so think about what that could look like for your community. Other digital inclusion workforce programs. And then this one's lengthy, so I'm just going to read it as stated. Equipment, instrumentation, networking capability, hardware and software or digital network technology for broadband services to covered populations at low or no cost. Create new or operating existing public computer centers for covered populations through community anchor institutions. And then any other project or activity this assistant secretary gives an okay for. So again, I just want to state that we won't know the exact requirements until the NOFO is published. So these are just what we've drawn from the materials that are publicly available. Okay, so that was the micro competitive grant program slides I had ready to talk about in case we had some questions for the competitive grant program. So we can open it up for questions on that.
Shauna, just a couple clarifying questions on what you've just shared. So just to be clear, this is separate from what we're talking about earlier with the application that's opening on September 25th. Can you just clarify the 2 confusing names again?
Yes, thanks, Abby. It is so confusing. So the Native Entity Capacity Grant Program is the program Davida and I gave all that information on before. And that's the application that opens in September. That application is only open to Native entities. The competitive grant program is that 3rd bucket of funds through the Digital Equity Act. And this competitive grant program is open to everybody that's eligible to apply. Oh, I just realized in our, okay, the entities that are eligible are the same entities that are eligible for the sub-grants that Davida talked about, are the entities that can apply to the competitive grant program. So we did cover that.
And Shauna, while you're on that, there was one question about who's eligible to apply, because you mentioned states, but there's a distinction between which state entities can apply because of the administering entities having a different status. Is that right?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I was using the word states because that's what that is in the application materials. I think that when they say states, they're talking about things outside of Native entities and territories. Would be like my understanding of how they're using that term. We can go back.
So,
to-
so just to be clear, for the competitive program, the entity that created the state digital equity plan, which is in most cases the Broadband Office, but oftentimes in other cases maybe the state library, they're called what's the administering entity. And they are the recipients for the capacity grant program that we just talked about for the state capacity part of the program. That administering entity, just the states, this does not apply to Native entities, just the states will not be eligible for the competitive grant program. However, other agencies within the state government will be. So, for instance, we'll just use my home state as an example. In North Carolina, the state broadband office is the administering entity. They will not be eligible for the competitive program, but the state library would. So that's the differentiator.
Okay, were there any other questions that I had missed? Michael, go ahead.
Is it okay if I talk?
Yes, please do.
Yeah.
Okay, so my question is about the NOFO. I just want to, I guess, confirm that the NOFO that was put in the chat, and I'm looking at it, was this updated after it was initially published to include the Native Entities Capacity Grant Program? Okay, because I was confused about the timing, how there was the planning grant funds that were intended for tribes, they got shifted over to the capacity grant. So if we're referencing an old NOFO that was published before that shift took place, where is the update reflected so that, so that I just want to know what we should reference to make sure that we're, doing the right thing when it comes to applying for funding for both planning and capacity grant. Not referencing just a PowerPoint presentation, but if there's like an official NTIA document somewhere that says that.
Yeah, Michael, that's a great question, and it is a little confusing. So what the NTIA did was they just took the funds for the set aside for Native entities for planning, and they added it to this capacity grant. So you can essentially, for Native entities, the funding pool, so you can essentially kind of forget about that old NOFO with the letters of intent, because it's all shifted into the new Native entities capacity grant section of the NOFO. So everything that you need to know about that is in this one current NOFO.
Oh, okay. And I see that this was published just recently.
Yes, in
March. Okay.
March,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mikhail, it was
Thank you.
published in March, and it started a 60-day window for states to apply, but the timeline for Native entities to apply, like Shauna outlined earlier, is longer and different. It didn't align with the state one. So that's also the confusion, is it was all put in one NOFO with 3 separate timelines, one for states, one for territories, and one for Native entities.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for helping me understand that better.
Yeah, you're welcome. There was a question in the chat that asked if Native entities would be able to apply for both. Yes, that is correct. Native entities can apply for the Native Entities Capacity Grant Program, as well as the Native Entity, I'm sorry, as well as the just competitive grant program. Some things to think about is how large of a project do you want to fund? The Native Entities Capacity Grant Program is funding projects between $500,000 and $2 million. The competitive grant, we think will be closer to $5 to $10 million. So if you have a smaller project, it might make more sense to apply for the capacity grant program instead of the competitive grant. The competitive grant program is also going to be very competitive. With large grants of that size, they're not going to be able to fund a ton of them. So that's another thing to keep in mind. I think we're about close to time.
I'm just going to add to your last note too that not only highly competitive is a competitive grant, also it being a larger grant, it might make sense to have more consortia applications in there. That's just seems like the way they're going, but we'll see. It's I assume, this is my personal, I assume that it's unlikely that a single tribe might get a competitive grant, but you know, we'll see how it goes. But that's just personally how I'm seeing it. So yeah. Yes. We're almost about time, 2 minutes left. Does anyone else have any questions, any pending questions out there? Well, of course, you can always reach out. You can reach out to the NDIA crew or me personally. I can put my email in the chat. And also you're welcome to outreach to us through other forms, such as the Indigenous Digital Inclusion Working Group, which meets monthly, as well as some other ways we also interact as well. So please let us know if you have any more questions. As you could probably tell, it is quite confusing, but we're gonna try to get this through together. And then I think the only thing is the form. We really do want your feedback, and I apologize, we're just fixing the form right now to see if there's any ways that any gaps in our resources that we can fulfill for folks. So yes, I don't know, Shauna, if we can reshare that out.
Yeah, we're still working on that form. Again, I really apologize. I don't know what's going on. So we'll get that out to you. Feel free, the slides are in the chat. It has my email in the slides. Feel free to reach out to me directly if you have any questions. And we will, I'll have Davida send the form out to the Indigenous Digital Inclusion Work Group.
We can add it to the slides too.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.